Welcome to the Human Factors and Ergonomics Hub, a series of educational podcasts that showcase the connection between human capabilities and good work design, brought to you by the Human Factors and Ergonomics Society of Australia. Hi and welcome to the HFE Hub. I'm Sharon Todd and today I'm chatting with Sidney Dekker. Let me say at this point that I am thrilled to have you on the podcast today. I certainly have heard some of your papers before. You've spoken at the Human Factors and Ergonomics Conference in Sydney quite some time ago. I do remember some aspects of that paper, and I have some of your books as well, Just Culture and Drifting into Failure, and you are very well respected, and it's such an honour to have you on the podcast today. Thank you for joining me.
Sure, pleasure. Happy to do it.
And so it would be really great for those that don't know you, just to maybe have you just chat a little bit about yourself, your background, how you ended up in human factors and ergonomics.
I've always, I always wanted to fly as a kid, and so I was 14 when I flew my first airplane. I soloed my first airplane when I was 14. Couldn't even drive or ride a moped, and so but I flew, Then at some point, I, of course, as you do as a teenager, you wonder about what the hell you're going to do after you're done with school. And my mom, at some point, sat down with me and say, so I'm the son of a preacher woman. My mom was one of the first female ministers in the Dutch Reformed Church. This was all playing out in the Netherlands, and she said to me, you're a good listener. You should study psychology. And so I went, oh, okay. Basically what my mom told me to do. And so I started on a course in psychology at the University of Nijmegen in the Netherlands, now known as Radboud University. And then gradually drifted into industrial organizational psychology, and because I sort of liked the idea of organizations and how psychology can help make things better there, and was on an internship, in fact, in Melbourne, mind you, where Brent Hayward in the course of this internship, which had nothing to do with aviation, actually. But Brent Hayward, some listeners might know him. He's basically well known in the aviation psychology circles and understands human factor economics quite well, obviously. And he himself has a strong track record in aviation safety, aviation psych. I really had a very underdeveloped idea of what that combination was all about. So after meeting Brent, I went, so where do I go to learn more about this? He said, you should go to Ohio State. I went, Ohio State? Yeah, Dick Jensen, right? He organizes this conference every year, every 2 years, whatever it was. And he's the man. You should really talk to Dick. And so I came home with this news. My dad told me that was great to hear. We're talking pre-internet age, right? I'm old enough for that. So there was no way to sort of investigate this online because there was no such thing. So my dad then says, you know what it is with the Yanks. If you don't show up in their face, that just nothing happens, and which is hugely categorical and probably unfair in all kinds of ways. But he may also have been right. So before too long, my dad and I were sitting in Dick Jensen's office at Ohio State. And so Dick then says, this is great, but my department doesn't have a PhD program. So what do you mean? Of course you should pursue a PhD, but you can't do that. So then he picked up the phone and he called Dave Woods' office at the main campus of the university. And I don't know, Sharon, but for once in the existence of my universe, the stars aligned. And Dave was there, and he picked up the phone, which was this must be among like such unique events like the sighting of the Virgin Mary or something, right? I mean, it was rather an unusual thing for Dave to actually be in his office and let alone pick up the phone. So, but he did. And Dick says, I got a potential PhD student. He looks pretty good. Can I send him over? Dave said, yeah, sure. So then we went down there, had a great chat. Dave had to do a seminar, went there, was completely begeistert by what he was saying and the kinds of things that then very, very young cognitive systems engineering was trying to offer the world and saying, it's about distributed cognition. This is not about the traditional human factors. And I increasingly got excited about the prospect of doing a PhD with Dave. And the types of questions that would allow me to dig into, but also the kind of energy in the lab that he ran, and together with Phil, and there was so much energy and excitement around that, and the other students I met were great, and I went, I want to do this. So I applied, got in, but of course was too late to start that year. So I did another year of experimental psych at Leiden University, with in fact Patrick Hudson was my advisor, and got to meet Uncle Jim a bunch of times, Jim Reason, who was working quite closely with Patrick and some other Leiden people at the time, and so was already ingratiating myself with that crowd, and at that point, Sharon, you're in. Boom, that's it. You're just part of the sort of the in family of the hotbed of human factors, cognitive systems engineering, at the time.
So, how did you decide actually what to do for the PhD with such incredible people?
That was awful. That was it. Like most people's PhDs theses, it's the thing you're least proud of and most hate. I think at some point, getting a PhD is just about getting a PhD. You're no longer changing the world. You're no longer really interested in what the hell it is that you're investigating. It was ultimately driven by research money. That's in Dave. Well, first, Charlie Billings, bless him, had just retired from NASA, brought a pot of money with him to write the aviation automation book, which came out in 1986. And I got to help him with that. And that paid for my first couple of years at Ohio State. And so as a graduate research assistant, I was helping Charlie put together his book. After that, I needed another about year of money, and that money came from what was known at the time as free flight, the idea that we should do air traffic control without the kinds of thinking in terms of airways that had been all the rigueur up to then. Our job was to investigate the human factors and safety implications of some aspects of that. And my PhD thesis eventually ended up in a tiny corner of that, trying to figure out some issues of delegation to automated partners in the system and management by exception, when you intervene. Some of the papers that came out of that indeed have titles like, to intervene or not to intervene. And it turns out to be a fairly difficult question. A signal detection theory, of course, which in part comes from that same area and tradition of scholarship in that area of the U.S., as you probably know, could help us decode some of the maths and modeling behind it. And so that thesis, was not really exciting or interesting. But at some point, as I said, getting a PhD then is just about getting a PhD.
So you've come a long way since then. Tell me about some of the work that you're doing at the moment.
Well, measured how? I don't know. It's have I come a long way measured in number of publications? Sure. Those are the KPIs to which I get held accountable, right? But no, I was dead set on not getting an academic job because I was so incredibly bored with being in academia. After 4 years of a PhD and graduate research assistance, I went, oh my God, this is awful. I don't want to do any of this ever again. So my first job was actually a postdoc with a British aerospace outfit. Which was even worse. It turned out to be incredibly boring. very tedious. And in about a year's time, I was very much looking for the exit. Which came in the form of an offer from Sweden. Where, interestingly, the Swedes were basically, I mean, tiny, at that point, unaligned country with its own very sizable defense industry. Haven't had a war in like 2 centuries, interestingly, but one may be correlated to another, but a strong defense industry and one of the biggest air forces in the world per capita. They were one of the first to develop a 4th generation fighter jet, which had some induced oscillation issues, and 2 of them crashed quite visibly publicly, and the country decided it needed help. It needed help in terms of human factors expertise. So Martin Helander, who was running that department at the time at Linköping, which is where they built the fighter jets, also because that's where Saab has its headquarters. They made me an assistant professor there, and that's right. Haven't looked back since, actually.
Tell me about the projects you're working on at the moment, then.
I mean, it's something they have come a long way from the kinds of human factors ergonomic design questions and questions about man-machine interface and human error at the sharp end. They have come quite, if I look at what I'm doing now, good God, the intervening years have seen me get closer and closer to the back end of disaster, accidents, failures. The rubble of airplanes strewn in fields, the dead patients after hospital procedures, issues in policing, firefighting, even military, other applications, construction, where if I were to summarize it, and this is not practiced because I need to construct this argument from the ground up, but I think, Sharon, what I'm finding and have been finding all along is that in human factors and ergonomics, we're pretty good at rigging up the theoretical apparatus for explaining how these things go wrong. We're also pretty good at suggesting how to not have it go wrong. Seem fairly disconnected from the kinds of organizational, political, emotive, ethical processes in the wake of these accidents, disasters, failures, mishaps, wrongdoings, harm, fairly disconnected from them in a way that allows us access to these processes so that we can meaningfully help steer an organization away from really bad decisions. As I wrote in one of my books, right, I spent hours sitting with a nurse, crying with her, who is in grief over the death of one of her tiny pediatric patients, and now she's being made to carry the can, up to and including a criminal prosecution, right? We've seen this, in fact, even recently at Vanderbilt with Redonda Vought, and nurses like her. These stories show up quite with alarming frequency in a way, and that's just in healthcare. I mean, we see this in lots of fields, right? The tendency of organizations to revert to blame, to reduce the failure, the incident, to the zigging versus zagging of one single frontline operator, and then saying, if only you had done this versus this, then it would never have happened. That so flies in the face, not only of anything ethical and compassionate and all of that, but it so flies in the face of what all the colleagues who are listening to this are doing every day, which is explaining the complexity of success and failures in these systems, right? failure doesn't get made by a single decision. Success doesn't get made by a single decision. I mean, since the 1970s, we have been importing in human factors and ergonomics. We've been importing the thinkings of let's say, the Barry Turners of this world, right? Man-made disaster theory, who constantly points our attention to the blunt end, right? That wasn't Uncle Jim. I mean, he said it, but that was 20 years old by that time. This is 1970s thinking. We need to look at the blunt end. We need to look at the administrative end, where procurement decisions get made, where people get resourced, where we set frontline people up for success or failure. That doesn't happen at the front end. That happens at the back end in other parts of the organization. This is where failure brews. This is where people are set up for success or not. And so, whereas we know this, whereas we have the theories to even explain it and carry the explanatory load of accidents in a way that is, I think, much more sophisticated, what I keep running into at the back end of these accidents is the pressures for simplification, the pressures for finding a quick, easy answer to why we are made to suffer. And if only we can point to one culprit and make them carry the load, we can kick them into out of paradise, right, so to say, and load it all on the back of the goat, kick him into the wilderness, and we're good to go again, right? And so I think if you look at my work over the last 10, 15, 20 years, I have been so moved in various ways, both in terms of getting pissed off, but also moved in terms of finding much compassion and a desire to help at the back end of accidents, incidents, wrongdoing, harm in organizations that ends up creating victims far beyond the original ones involved in the incident. This is becoming a very long sentence, that you see my work concentrate itself around questions of justice, questions of compassion, questions of how do we do the right thing after it's gone wrong? Actually, that's a very good question. How do we do the right thing after it's gone wrong? Could be the title of yet another book, but then again, I write them quicker than you can read them, so it's
It could be, and do you think organisations want to find other reasons why things have gone on when blame is so easy?
I think the way to answer that is to look a little closer at one premise wrapped up in the question, which is the monolithic idea of an organization, right? An organization is lots of things, lots of force fields, lots of intentions, lots of ethical ebbs and flows, lots of political movement. And so I'm sure, on the basis of all my experiences, very often an organization is many-faced in the aftermath of accidents, disaster, incidents, harm. And so I think we can always find leverage points for those who do want to do the right thing. Yes, there will very likely always be pressure to simplify, to reduce, to blame, to move on, to find a sense of closure, but also a sense of control, because that seems to often be, I don't think, not only the sort of the managerial poise, you're a manager, you're an accountable manager. I need to find control. How do I control these things going wrong? Well, I just need to be more punitive to my people and remind them to follow the existing procedures. And then, in fact, we just got off the phone before we started the podcast with somebody in healthcare who has a chief executive who's exactly like that, right? How can I threaten people in the most effective ways so that they do the right thing? Of course, we know from the research that all that happens is you drive real performance underground, right? And you create cultures of risk secrecy and learning disabilities, and it all is extremely negative. And you create this sense of safety theater, right? Which, by the way, is a title of, in fact, a new book that is coming out in a few months, right? But the idea that safety theater, which in fact was what a Polish colleague told me that they call it in of course Polish, which is both inscrutable and unpronounceable, but because it's got too many consonants stacked one after another. But the idea of safety theater is that we present an image of an idealized organization in which we're all doing the right thing, or as Eric Olnager would say, work is imagined, and we keep the work as done as far out of view as we can from those who could make life difficult if they did know how we actually get stuff done. And so I think the question you asked was actually different from the little exposition I just laid out. Take me back to it.
We were talking about what happens. So organisations blame others, and they just need to drop the load on somebody and tick that box and go, yep, we found the cause, and so they can wear it all. And we know that that's not the case. And I was then asking the question of, do we really think organisations actually want to not blame people? Is there Cool. So what else? I suppose one question, just change it slightly, is, well, what else, given that blame seems to be so easy, what else can we suggest should actually happen?
Oh, well, I wrote, another book, which is called Stop Blaming. So that would be one suggestion.
That'd work.
Stop blaming, which is, not a very empowering message or title either. But, there's a subtitle, I think. Yeah, there is, which says something like build a restorative just culture or something like that. But so it's not only stop doing this, but actually start doing this, right? No, I think the for us in the field, right, it's really useful, I think, to understand the distinction between an epistemological desire and an existential one. So the epistemological desire, right? Epistemology, of course, Greek for basically the philosophy about knowledge, right? How do we know what we know? All of science is sort of an epistemological, well, not all of it, but epistemological endeavor. We try to find out things, but we need to explain to others how we know these things. Otherwise, you can't get it published, right? Well, you can't just make a wild claim. No. How do you know this, right? Well, that's an epistemological question. Finding out about cause should be a purely epistemological project, right? As in, it's about knowledge. It's about finding out what happened. It's about digging into the organizational back end and seeing where these things come from and how they produce success or failure at the sharp end. And so what we find, though, is that rather than answering an epistemological question, when organizations blame, is they answer an existential question. And that's a question of control and suffering and bad things happening in the universe. And how can we stop that from happening? Well, the easiest way to convince yourself that you can stop it from happening is to reduce it down to a really simple binary thing that somebody else screwed up. And you say, well, stop doing that, and it will never happen again. Or we're going to kick you out of the organization, and that takes care of the problem. And if others might be so inclined to do the same stupid thing, at least they will see that you were kicked out. And so, pour encourager les autres, right, to encourage the others to do the right thing, we will make an example out of you, which never works, by the way, right? And there's research backing up that particular claim too. But if we in the field are aware of the confusion of the epistemology versus the existentialism behind the question asked and answered by blame, I think that would help a lot, right? Epistemologically, blame doesn't work because it doesn't explain an incident at all, right? It's ridiculous to suggest that we need a whole complex, big organization with a large back end to ensure success at the sharp end. And then when things go wrong, to all of a sudden say, oh, no. That's merely because somebody at the sharp end didn't zig where they should have zagged, or zagged where they zigged, or whatever. Epistemologically, that doesn't work, right? If complexity explains success, complexity is required to explain failure. We cannot get away from that. And if you do, you're doing violence to the science of how things succeed, and you don't really understand human factors at all. So it's an existential pursuit, right? To say it's just because of this claim, of this person whom we can blame for this incident. We solve an existential problem. Where does suffering come from? How do we control this? Well, reduce it, simplify it, make the complexity of it go away. And so if we, in the field, right, as colleagues, understand the tension between those two, I think that would help a lot. What can we tell organizations to do other than stop blaming? This is, of course, the quest of the last 10, 15, 20 years of my work.
So what have you come up with? Acknowledgement?
No. Yeah, sure, there is that, but it's more than that. It's more than that. But I mean, in a very clunky sort of procedural sense, you could say, look, instead of asking questions about rules, violations, and consequences, right, which is typically what organizations do, right? I mean, who screwed up? What rule was broken? Who did that? How bad is that breach, right? Have they done it before? And thus, which should the consequences be? Well, we kick him out, or we send him a letter, or we put up a poster to remind everyone to take this procedure more seriously, or something silly like that, right? Instead of asking that, ask questions about impacts, needs, and obligations. And that's essentially what the literature suggests very strongly. If you have an incident, mishap, that creates impact. People are impacted by this. The people on the receiving end of it, the patients, passengers, the whatever, but also the practitioners, the ones that we work for in human factors, right? That we concentrate our work around. They're impacted by this. The whole idea of second victimhood, right? The creation of second victims rather than just first victims who are directly affected by the incident. The second victim is often the practitioner who feels professionally responsible and might feel quite guilty for being involved in an incident. And the literature shows us that this leads to all kinds of very, very deep questioning and problems, up to and including suicide. And so certainly practitioners leaving their profession or asking to be put on different or less onerous shifts, or indeed just leaving altogether, or indeed leaving life altogether. And so understanding that there are impacts that are wide and deep is the first step. So as an organization, that's the question. Who's impacted? Then the second question is, what do they need? Because impacts create needs. And I think we need to be more generous and open-minded and open-hearted when it comes to understanding the needs that these impacts create. Sometimes, I mean, I've seen this, right? We know about an incident, say in an air traffic air navigation service provider or something, and we think we meet the needs that arise from that incident by giving somebody an hour away from the scope. Right? Here's drink some water. Here's a coffee. Do you need to talk to someone? All right, let's get back in. Right, back in the saddle. Well, that may not be the need that they have at all. Their need may be very different. So let's be open-minded about what that need is, and open-minded also means listen. Right? Then thirdly, once you've identified needs, they lead to obligations, because you as an organization have the obligation to meet these needs. If people who do your work, right, at the sharp end up in a situation where they get needs that go beyond what is normal for their job to provide to them, you have the obligation to meet those needs. Do they need a few days off? Do they need to make calls to somebody overseas in order to get in touch with some family member who's really important to them in relation to the thing that they've just suffered or whatever? Do they need trauma counseling? Again, the needs can be wide and deep, and so I think, Sharon, what we should always remind organization leaders of, and I don't think we should hesitate at all, given the work that we do, whatever you do in human factors ergonomics, right? However much at the front line or design work you do, we need to make leaders aware that they are servant leaders, that they only have one job, one role, and that is to make frontline work possible. That's why they're there. It's not that these frontline people work for them. No. The leaders work for the frontline people. And anything that leaders do that don't help frontline work becoming possible is, in the words of David Graeber, a bullshit job. It's bullshit work. You shouldn't be doing it. You're wasting your time. Oh, but I'm really important. I have lots of emails and meetings and, everybody wants to talk to me. Yeah. That's all really cute. But your job, your only role is to make frontline work possible, because that is the point of value creation. This is why these organizations exist. They don't exist because of their administrative back end, of their managerial layers. No, they exist because of the work that they deliver to the community, whichever community it is, at the front end. That's why they exist. Anything that you're doing that is not helping to make that possible is bullshit work, right? I mean, that may sound very categorical, but sometimes that's exactly the wake-up call that we need to give leaders. And I think for us as human factors ergonomics professionals, to get both the support and the freedom to say, well, I can help you with these specific aspects of that frontline work becoming possible. Because not only is it the point of value creation, it is also the point of risk. This is where the risk that builds up in your entire organizational backend will find its way and concentrate, right? And that's the point at which it shows up. And so we at Human Factors Ergonomics, we are at the front line there to help them understand that and make that visible.
How do we make the understanding of impact, identifying of needs and identifying of obligations something that companies can, how do we make it tangible?
I think the first step is to recognize that often it's not as if companies or leaders are incapable of showing compassion, incapable of listening to their heart. I think it is in part our role to help them understand that rigorous alternatives to blame, to asking about rules and violations and consequences, are available. That there are rigorous alternatives which are proven, behind which there sits a large and growing literature that suggests that all kinds of markers of organizational success go up if you do these sorts of things, right? You get more honesty, more openness. The NHS just published a huge study, right, that shows that cultures of openness in NHS trusts are positively correlated with fewer deaths. And so you just kill fewer people. We have a study from the implementation of restorative just culture, right? So the needs, impacts, obligations at Gold Coast Hospital shows that the number of suicide reattempts goes down after implementing restorative just learning culture in mental health care. Sharon, we're literally saving lives by making these cultural organizational changes. That wakes people up. It is a rigorous alternative. And ultimately I go back to the idea that, whatever we have received to give. We're not here for long, right? 4,000 weeks, that's it, right? So wow. We might as well, that's it, right? And so we might as well contribute something positive.
Does this come from consultation? I'm assuming it does. So this is obviously talking to people. So how do organizations make that happen?
I mean, first of all, there needs to be a realization that, and some of your listeners may have seen some of the documentaries, right? So, for example, the documentary on Just Culture, where one of the executives literally sits there and says to the interviewer, "Well, we have to change the way we do this." They had come to a point where they started recognizing that the kind of harm that they were inflicting after harm had already occurred, as in the secondary harm that they were inflicting on their own people, because of the way to which they responded to the primary harm, was such that measured in terms of cost, just the dollar cost, but also measured in terms of turnover, staff turnover, measured in terms of mental health consequences for their own staff, sick leave, absenteeism, pushed them to the point where they no longer could deny that this had something to do, or was in fact concentrated firmly around their own way in which they were responding to failure. And so I think if we listen well and are compassionate in how we understand the force field in which these leaders have to play, we can lead them there. It is, I think, in part our role to say, yeah, we can fix things at the front end for you. Absolutely. And I've done it, literally. I've said this to and yeah, this was perhaps a bit unsophisticated, but I'll quote myself. And so if it needs to be beeped over, beep it over. But basically, we'd been doing a bunch of sharp end work for this organization. And then when an incident occurred, I was actually out of town. Incident occurred. And the first thing that I hear when I come back is that the two most junior people involved at the front end on a night shift were swiftly and immediately stood down by the CEO. So I was a bit pissed, obviously, right? So because we're doing all this work on the front end, as you do in human factors economics, right? And you help make the delivery of frontline work become more efficient, more man-machine, all of that, all the stuff that we do, right? I said, so I went to CEO. I went, we can keep doing what we're doing, but you have to stop doing dumb shit. And literally what I said, right? Then I explained myself. But that in itself is not enough, right? You have to then say, well, how do you stop doing dumb shit? Well, yeah, here's the alternative, right? Next time that happens, follow these steps a little bit more, right? So not just tell them to stop doing dumb stuff. I think the first rule that we can give them is first do nothing, right? If an incident has happened, unless there are damage mitigation measures to be taken, absolutely, you got to do those. But otherwise, first, do nothing. There is no rush, right? Sit on your hands. As one of my students, he said it beautifully to one of his managers at some point. He said, and you might figure out what field he was from. He said, sit back, relax, enjoy the bad news. Sit on your hands, sit back, relax, enjoy the bad news. You don't have to act immediately. This is where I see many leaders go into self-destructive mode very often when they go, well, I need to take a strong stance and show them that safety is very important, and we cannot afford these things, and everybody needs to be reminded that this is our number one priority. Yeah, well, if it is, sit on your hands. Sit on your hands. You don't have to act immediately. Which is just so basic, right? We try to tell our kids this, right? When they lose their patience or lose their temper, count to 10, right? Count to 10 or whatever, however much you need to count. But sit on your hands. You don't have to act immediately. Then go in and show up. Show up. Listen. Understand why it made sense for people to do what they did, right? In some sense, I think if leaders are reminded of the fact that an incident like this is a stress test on them, a stress test on their organization. And I think the stress test consists of a couple of things, right? First is can you answer the question why this usually goes well? And I think that deflects a lot of the energy that would otherwise end up in a bad place into more productive spaces. So yes, an incident has happened, but they happen rarely. So why does it normally go well? Let's answer that question, and also recognize it's very much a Holnagelian, right, an Eric Holnagel question, which is, as you know, right, Safety 2 is all about trying to understand why things normally go well. Well, let's throw that question in right here, because then we start to direct the conversation toward the capacities that exist in the organization that normally make things go well. And then we can start a much more measured conversation about why they sometimes don't go well. Could be because of the absence of one particular ingredient, could be because of long-standing issues which we've been managing adequately but imperfectly for years, right? Resourcing shortages or procurement issues or equipment play-ups, right? That have had workarounds. I mean, anybody in ergonomics, human factors would probably have familiarity with these sorts of things, right? That people work around their equipment shortcomings, which now in this particular combination of factors was inevitable in that it led to an incident. But normally we're able to manage it. Well, why the difference? Help us understand this. Much more measured conversation comes out of that. So that's the first stress test, right? First stress test is, can you sit on your hands and then inquire after the capacities that normally make it go well, right? So to broaden out the conversation rather than who screwed up? I need their heads on a platter kind of questioning. The second part of the stress test is, I think, to hew very closely and to remain true to 80-year-old human factors thinking, which is human error is not a cause of trouble. It's a consequence of trouble, right? Fitz and Jones, 1942, 1941, 1946, 1947, right? But even Alphonse Chapanis before that, right? Showing in all of the work done on the back end of the Army Air Corps in the Second World War, and the work that the Brits did, that error is a consequence. It is directly linked to the features of the tools and tasks that we give people to work with. It doesn't come as a brain fart out of the blue, right? Error is a consequence. That means that the second part of the stress test is to survive that, is to see error as a consequence and to begin to explore where the causes of that error lie deeper into the system, right? As I say in one of the books, right? It's not a cause of your trouble. It's a consequence of trouble deeper inside your system. Survive that part of the stress test by pointing attention there, right? Start digging further. And the third part of the stress test, I think, Sharon, is how are you treating the people involved? Surviving that part of the stress test requires you to muster some compassion, which is where you show up, you listen, you understand, you move closer, you open your heart. Because these people did not come to work to do a bad job, right? I mean, that's another fundamental, in fact, foundational principle of human factors ergonomics, right? The local rationality principle, which is what people do makes sense to them at the time, given their goals, given their knowledge, given their focus of attention, right? We have to assume that, otherwise we're dealing with psychotics, right? Which is not our field, right? We deal with people who show up to do a good job, which means that what they're doing makes sense given their focus of attention, their knowledge, their goals. And so the local rationality principle demands of us to show compassion, because people didn't come to work to screw things up. They didn't come to work to create accidents or incidents, right? People don't show up for work generally to do a bad job. And so that assumption, again, is based in so much deep thinking in human factors ergonomics going back, to the 1960s, 70s. This has been along in our field for quite a while, that I think we can confidently import that into a stress test that we throw at leaders at the end or in the wake of an incident. That's what we do. Those are the steps.
You also talk about forgiveness.
Jacques Derrida beautifully says, on peut seulement pardonner ça que c'est impardonnable. You can only forgive the unforgivable, which is very deep, as it would be with Jacques Derrida, obviously. But so, in a sense, that's true. It's one of the more recent papers, right? My argument, I think, in that paper, Sharon, is as follows. Often we are made to believe, or we make ourselves believe, that forgiveness is not a morally serious alternative to disciplinary action or acting more strongly in the wake of failure or incidents. The argument I make is, well, hang on. So what makes an action in the wake of failure morally serious? And how would forgiveness not meet those criteria? I mean, you'd have to read the paper to, and you're very welcome to post the link to the paper together with the podcast somewhere if you want to. But because it's open source, I think. Yeah, what leaders typically think a morally serious response to failure holds people accountable. Takes the ethical weight of the wrongdoing seriously, and appends appropriate consequences to the reaction. The whole notion of accountability is a fraught one, obviously, but those who know my work would know that I often try to sort of follow in Ginny Sharp's and others' footsteps in claiming that the best accountability is forward-looking accountability. It's thinking about an account not as something that you settle or pay, but as something that you talk about, you tell. An account is something you tell, you share, you rally around. It's a story, it's a lesson, it's a learning. And forward-looking accountability means that you take that learning and use that to set people up for success going forward. Again, we're talking about servant leadership, right? Your role is to set people up for success. Otherwise, why are you there? right? Go away, do something else. As a leader, you need to set people up for success so that frontline work becomes possible and safe and good and efficient and all of that. And so forward-looking accountability is very much oriented at exactly that. Then to be made to feel the ethical import and weight of an incident and your contribution to it is something that people would associate with a morally serious response. Well, there's a couple of ways to think about that. I mean, the first is obviously to think about second victims. And Sharon, I have not yet met a second victim. I mean, I've met many second victims. I've not yet met one who doesn't carry the weight, the ethical weight of their involvement in the incident on their shoulders, like Atlas carries the world. They are weighted down in a way that is not only impossible to describe, but inconceivable for those who haven't been on that end of the equation. And so my first response would be, don't worry about it. The ethical weight of their involvement in the incident is being carried and felt in ways that you cannot even begin to imagine, right? But if you insist, there are ways to play with this. John Braithwaite, right, calls it reintegrative shaming, right? You can say, yeah, we want you to be part of the moral community again. We want you to be back in the saddle. We want you behind the scope. We want you at the operating table. We want you in the cockpit. We want you in the job. But here's the steps you have to take. And those steps are a ritual, as John would describe it, of reintegrative shaming. You have to do these things. You have to tell others about your involvement. You have to get on a toolbox talk or a pre-work briefing and explain how things could go so terribly wrong, so that we all might learn. And yes, you might feel quite embarrassed and ashamed and all of that, but the hell with that. That's part of being a professional. So that's part of the process. And so creating these, or bring a case of brandy or something, right, or whatever it might be, as an act of atonement. So there are various ways. In fact, there's a limited number of ways in which we can imagine these processes of reintegrative shaming to happen. These rituals to play out for you to become once again a member of the moral community. And so those are morally incredibly serious things to do. In fact, and the literature shows that it's much more serious than firing or disciplining someone. Particularly if you fire someone, it turns out that the effect of making others afraid of the consequences of their own action tends to disappear, because the person who would be there to remind you of it is gone, right? And evaporated. And is just, there might be a story or a rumor, but that's it, right? Which doesn't carry the same sort of power as a ritual of reintegrative shaming might. So the literature is quite generous to us in terms of suggesting alternatives for morally serious alternatives, and then we might come back and indeed forgive. I mean, forgiveness as a process typically is morally serious in the sense that if you indeed see forgiveness as a process rather than as a free gift bestowed on people, right, unmerited, undeserved, as an act of grace or mercy, which is possible too. But if you see it more as a process, as a transaction, then it has to be necessarily preceded by acts of confession, right? Truth telling. You have to tell us the truth of what happened. You have to repent, as in show us that you really feel bad about having been involved in it, and then atone. What are you going to do now to atone for having been involved in this? And yeah, those sound like very atavistic terms, but there's absolutely no obstacles for organizations to choreograph that into their post-incident processes. Absolutely possible. And so those are exciting prospects, I think, for the research in the coming years, Sharon. How can we help organizations literally choreograph these sorts of things into their responses to failure?
Given that I don't have the answer to that, I'm a bit dumbfounded.
That's only good. Those are exactly the right research questions we need to ask, right? If there were easy answers, they weren't interesting research questions. So,
what's next for you? Are you going to work in that space? Is that what you're looking at the moment? Is that the next project for you?
Thank you. Yeah, we're in fact involved in a couple of projects which have been triggered by a new problem in this space, which is the issue, particularly the post-COVID issue of occupational violence inflicted on frontline people in various professions, particularly public-facing ones like public healthcare, public transport, where the general decline of behavioral norms, I'm perhaps overgeneralizing here, but us becoming less social on the back of the COVID pandemic, as well as the growing atomization and of societies and loneliness, has led to, as well as a growing sense of anger and entitlement, has led to a seemingly unstoppable increase of incidents of occupational violence in a number of areas. And so we're working with various organizations, in fact, on a research project across the world, with finding novel models of how to respond to this. Because it turns out that more aggressive responses have sort of a use-by date, and or a point beyond which they a sweet spot beyond which they don't really work anymore. More surveillance, more aggressive responses, more punitive and retributive responses don't seem to deal with the problem well at all. And it's interesting that this issue is inflicted on organizations by societies, but they require a coherent organizational answer. Which often is lacking. What we're finding is that the idea of again, you've heard me say this word multiple times, but the idea of compassion in this does seem to open doors to thinking differently. And we are going to shoot another documentary, and so I would love your listeners to be on the lookout for this. Hopefully later in the year it will be all done. These things are both incredibly intensive, work intensive and hour intensive, as well as expensive to make. And so in fact, that's where a lot of the money of the research project is going. But we also know that if we do make a successful documentary out of this, just like we did with the Just Culture film, for example, or the Safety Differently one, that this really can move the dial about how people think about these sorts of things. So that's certainly one of the more concrete ways in which ideas about forgiveness, compassion, thinking about the complexity of failure, and getting organizations to wrap their head around that, and helping them increase the repertoire of responses to include less blame and more compassion certainly fits.
Thanks for joining us at the Human Factors and Ergonomics Hub, brought to you by the Human Factors and Ergonomics Society of Australia, where human-centred design really matters. If you like this podcast, make us your favourite in your podcast app. We look forward to chatting with you next time.